Hi, everybody, and welcome to episode number 442 of For Immediate Release. I'm Shel Holtz.
And I'm Neville Hobson, and we're recording this the day after Christmas Day. And this topic is very timely news-wise. It's in the news, but it has depth of distinct interest to communicators. And this is the huge kerfuffle surrounding the actors Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni and the aftermath of the work they did on the film It Ends With Us. It's become a flashpoint for ethical discussion in the PR and entertainment industries. The incident, as covered by many, the BBC, CEO Today, New York Times that I've seen today, in fact, and many others, showcases a disturbing confluence of workplace misconduct allegations and aggressive reputation management strategies. With continuing allegations over egregious behaviors by PR pros and agencies, what are the impacts for practitioners and the profession? We'll address this question right after this. The conflict began during the production of It Ends With Us, where Blake Lively accused Baldoni and producer Jamie Heath of boundary violations and inappropriate behavior, prompting the studio Wayfarer to implement safeguards such as hiring an intimacy coordinator. Despite these measures, tensions persisted, particularly over creative control. Lively ultimately won significant input into the film's final cut and received a producer credit. As the film approached its release, private messages revealed a coordinated effort by Baldoni and his crisis PR team, led by Melissa Nathan, to damage Lively's reputation. The campaign allegedly involved amplifying negative narratives about Lively online while suppressing stories of Baldoni's alleged misconduct. Techniques included fostering untraceable social media narratives, leveraging media connections to plant damaging stories, and utilizing tactics reminiscent of campaigns seen in other high-profile cases, like that of Johnny Depp and Amber Heard. Documents disclose that Baldoni and his team sought to portray Lively as difficult to work with and opportunistic, aiming to shift public focus from his actions to her perceived shortcomings. This strategy significantly impacted Lively's career and personal brand, resulting in a decline in her hair care product sales and public backlash against her. The PR tactics used in this case highlight the ethical quandaries surrounding the industry's role in reputation management. The notion that PR professionals could systematically attempt to bury an individual raises questions about the need for stricter professional standards, such as licensing or accreditation for PR practitioners, something Shel and I have discussed many times in this podcast. Baldoni's public image has remained relatively intact despite the revelations, while Lively has suffered reputational damage. Critics argue this outcome underscores the pervasive double standards in how society evaluates men and women in public controversies. Allegations of harassment and subsequent retaliation illustrate persistent issues within Hollywood's power dynamics. The case exemplifies how crisis management can veer into ethically dubious territory, with real-world consequences for individuals and public discourse. It also strengthens the argument for introducing licensing requirements for PR practitioners to enforce ethical standards and accountability. A number of PR practitioners have weighed in on this, especially on LinkedIn. Many are highly critical of the alleged egregious behavior and actions of some PR practitioners. But before we look at what others have to say, Shel, what's your take on the PR issues arising from all of this?
Well, it leads me to reiterate my belief that we do need licensing or a requirement for certification for people to work in this industry, because there are no repercussions to the agency that engaged in this behavior, and this behavior is beyond the pale. I mean, if you look at the codes of ethics of any association out there that represents people in the communications industry, PRSA, IABC, CPRS, CIPR, they have violated several of these. Truth and accuracy is one. I mean, they engaged in defamation and they spread falsehoods. I mean, the core of her lawsuit is the accusation that Baldoni and his team spread these false and damaging stories about her, and that violates PRSA's code of ethics, which does emphasize honesty and accuracy in communications. They misused influence, his position, and I think this has come out more strongly since this story has gained the legs that it has. He has been a prominent advocate for women's rights. So, I mean, he's misusing his influence there to attack a woman, potentially harm a colleague is a breach of trust. There's a lack of transparency involved here, which is another PR principle of fostering open and honest communication. The smear campaign was conducted covertly. She didn't know about it. She didn't have the opportunity to respond to any of these accusations. And the harassment in the smear campaign, potential abuse of power dynamics in the entertainment industry, where I'm really glad that I don't work. I should note that my father was in the entertainment industry, and I was exposed to it a lot growing up, and determined early on that I really didn't want anything to do with it. But PR professionals do have a responsibility to ensure that their actions don't enable this kind of abuse. And I think the thing that disturbs me the most is that there are ways that a PR agency could have taken on this account and handled it well. I mean, by prioritizing truth and accuracy, absolutely advise against defaming the person that is on the other side of this argument, facilitating open communication, upholding professional standards, all could have been brought to bear in a strategy that would have worked. This is the easy way out for Bladoni. And frankly, I think that the people who did this should be ashamed of themselves. I'm sure they're not. I'm sure they're very proud of the results of this. Although, to be honest, the more this story grows, the worse it is for Bladoni. His reputation was looking pretty good for a while, but the more discussion there is around this, the more it's backfiring against him, because he's being seen as a guy who hired an agency that did these things. You also, because this has gotten so public, have a lot of people coming to Blake Lively's defense, including Colleen Hoover, who wrote the book that the movie was based on. I don't know if she wrote the screenplay or was heavily involved in the film, but when you have all of these people publicly standing behind Lively, it's not going to stand well for Bladoni. So ultimately, I don't think this worked out for him, but only because it got the amount of attention it did. This PR agency takes on work like this all the time. I don't know if there have been previous instances where they have taken the same approaches and it just hasn't gotten the kind of exposure that this assignment did. But in a world in which they had to be certified in order to do this kind of work, the certifying agency or the licensing agency would be able to revoke it because of the violation of ethics, and they wouldn't be able to do this work anymore. That doesn't happen. Yeah. As I've said a million times, anyone can hang out a shingle that says public relations on it and take on clients and behave any way they want. And that's what happened here.
Yeah, it looks that way, doesn't it? And what sort of takes me aback a bit too is the strong way in which the agency defends what they're doing, just doing their job. I saw just before we started recording this an article in People magazine that was in my feed that I'm following for this. I thought, someone's mentioning astroturfing finally. Has it come back again? I don't think it ever went away.
No.
In fact, there's a text in the narrative which I thought was absolutely to the point. It says, at the core of Lively's allegations is astroturfing, a strategy designed to manipulate public opinion by creating the illusion of grassroots support or backlash. The complaint claims that Bladoni's crisis PR firm, the agency group, that's TAG PR, coordinated social media efforts to portray her as controlling and difficult during the film's production. And it notes a paragraph later emphasizing that they were simply doing their job because everyone does this. I think there's absolute bollocks, to use a technical term we have over here in the UK. I can't believe that for a second, but there are many who do, though. I want to mention, just share really some of the conversation that's been going on LinkedIn in particular. Bob Pickard, whose name I think you're all familiar with, Shell.
Oh, sure.
He wrote just for Christmas, I felt nauseous reading this article. We can bury anyone inside a Hollywood smear machine in the New York Times. And that is a really good article, I have to say, on this kerfuffle. No proper professional communicator with even a simulacrum of ethics could ever debase themselves using such gutter tactics of character assassination. No genuine crisis public relations expert, quote unquote, could conceive of writing down such slimy nonsense or so lacking in judgment as we can bury anyone. All too often, celebrity publicity does not equal communications professionalism. And there are quite a number of comments to that post that he made. There's also another one I want to reference too, which is in the House of Marketing and PR Communications group on Facebook. That was posted again just for Christmas Day by Helen Reynolds. And she had an interesting take here. She starts by saying, possibly a popular, unpopular opinion. I work in comms, not PR. It's an old debate, but this story about Melissa Nathan, that's the PR person mentioned earlier, has made me embarrassed. The popular idea is and always has been that smearing people and cover-ups are the job. I don't want to be associated with PR, she says. Ironically, PR as a profession has the worst reputation. The term is permanently tainted, she says. And she's had responses from a number of people who say, well, hang on a minute, you're tarring the whole profession like this. The whole profession is not like this. That's, I guess, a point of all of this, because it is highlighting what the negatives in the profession, of which that's what's getting attention, not the good the profession does. So this debate, no doubt, on this angle in particular, the professionalism or lack of certain people who work in the PR industry is highlighting this whole point about, wait a minute, if this was some kind of like doctors, like lawyers and so forth, where you are in a sense judged by others before you get a license. You have to apply and be verified and all that kind of stuff. You wouldn't have this. Well, I think that's probably a little naive saying you wouldn't have this. You would still, but you'd be able to do something about it if you do. We've talked about this lots of times before. Your view is strong on this. I know. I don't disagree with you either. I don't believe this is going to happen. I'd hate to say it like that.
It's not going to happen.
No, this might get lots of debate going, such as what we're having in this podcast, what I'm seeing people writing on social networks like LinkedIn. Will anything actually happen? As Helen mentions, popular, unpopular, or possibly popular, it's a mouthful to get, tongue twist to get the word, my mouth around that. Possibly unpopular opinion. Because it clearly isn't something front of mind to many in this profession. I don't see a kind of groundswell of people demanding, something must be done about this. I don't see any of that. I don't see the professional bodies commenting on this publicly at all. So clearly this is not, I guess, embarrassing enough to force action. So what's to be done, do you think?
Well, I don't know what other PR agencies would do if their billings are fine. And as we reported recently, talking about the Edelman layoffs and trauma at other agencies, billings aren't fine right now. So maybe this is the time for some self-reflection in the industry. But I think, one of the challenges that you face with the reputation of PR as an industry is that because you have people like this and agencies like this engaging in behaviors like this, and that's what gets the attention. And how much attention does it get in the public media when a PR agency has a successful engagement that was done completely ethically, that ticked all of the boxes on codes of ethics? It never gets talked about. So what does that lead to? It leads to portrayals of public relations people in the movies and TV and novels as being more like this individual than the people that you and I know, Bob Picard, for example, who do engage in their practice based on a solid foundation of ethics. So as you mentioned, the problem is that there are no consequences. There's nothing that's going to happen to her. I mean, she's looking at all this bad press right now over this, but how many celebrities are looking at this and say, yeah, she's the one I want in my corner, and something bad happens? I imagine she's going to do rather well as a result of this, sadly. But, by the way, I should note my view that licensing or a mandatory certification should be a requirement is 180 degrees from where I used to be on this issue. When I heard people talk about it, my argument was no, because if you look at the professions that do require this, the law, accounting, medicine, things like that, there's one right way to do things. And in public relations, there's a tremendous amount of creativity and a tremendous amount of flexibility. There's dozens of ways, hundreds of ways that you could approach any assignment that you get in a PR agency. And how do you regulate that? And I have come around based purely on ethics. So we're not going to say there's one way to do something, but there are clearly ethical and unethical ways of doing it. And that's what the licensing or certification bodies would be looking at in a world where it was required. When a complaint was filed that this violated ethics, well, we'll look at it, we'll investigate, and we will determine what the consequences should be. Should it be a reprimand? Should it be a revocation of the license or the certification? These bodies would have to come up with the committees or groups that would make these assessments. But I don't see it happening anytime soon because I don't see the motivation out there to do this. And of course, it's not the PR industry that would do this. It would be the business community. I mean, it's not the lawyers who say you have to have a license to practice law. It's the state in the United States. It's California. You have to pass the California bar. So
Right.
at some level, it would have to be a governmental body, some kind of a public institution that would need to make the determination that this has gone far enough and we need to start licensing or certifying these people.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I can see that quite clearly. It's sad. I think. I mean, I was thinking when I was thinking about this today. Organizations, many have codes of ethics that they publish. I'm talking about in the profession, not just general businesses, but although some do, but mostly you will see this in advertising, in PR, of course, in marketing, where people publicly state we follow this code of ethics practice. I wonder, none come to mind that are kind of quite outstanding and all-encompassing and embrace this kind of topic, that this is not how we conduct ourselves here. The easy thing, perhaps, would be to say, if you're a member of a professional body, they have a code of ethics and you have to publicly support that. And many people do. None of that is enough, right? So you're right. It's not the professional associations; it's the clients, let's say, who might need. But there is no motivation.
Yeah, and I think there's an opportunity for education, that you want to look for an organization with individuals who have the certification from a credible organization like the Global Communication Certification Council. But one other point, just to make, you brought it up with that People article talking about astroturfing. Yeah. I don't know why anybody would think it had ever gone away. Astroturfing originally was really difficult to pull off. What you had to have was a network of people that you could send a letter to, and then they would rewrite that letter and sign it and send it to their local newspaper to appear in the letters to the editor. So essentially you had the same letter in hundreds of local newspapers, showing a groundswell of public grassroots support for whatever the issue was. In the digital world, with influencers and social media, it has gotten a lot easier. So there's more astroturfing, not less, taking place today.
Yeah, we see it, although I don't see people calling it astroturfing so much, but it is what it is. I remember in the current climate, i.e. digital, since the turn of the century, I first came across that term in you'll remember this, Shell, the early days of blogging, Global PR Week, version 1.0.
Of course.
That had, a lot of people who we know who are still active discussing this whole thing. And I've seen other discussions since then, but nothing really, there's no needles have been moved. Other than it gets into public consciousness. So maybe someone might hear what we're talking about and think, okay, let me amplify this topic. That I think would be a good idea if we said to people, look, if you hear this and you are kind of in broad agreement with the topic we're discussing here, please talk about it. Please amplify it to others. And maybe that way someone's going to take notice. So don't write to your member of parliament or that kind of stuff. Just talk about it on your networks and raise it with your communities and see what people have to say. Will that make a difference? I put my cynicism aside, but only in the sense that don't have your expectations set too high. But if enough people start talking about this, it might get some traction at some point.
Yeah, my expectations are not set very high. And that'll be a 30 for this episode of For Immediate Release.